Okay, we're back. That was not really a short break, but we will get through this last chapter. So this chapter is white blood cell disorders. And we're only gonna go through these first 4 videos. So hopefully it shouldn't take too long.
Chapter 6 of the text deals with white blood cell disorders, and the very first discussion that we're going to have concerns leukopenia and leukocytosis. Let's begin by reminding ourselves that the hematopoietic stem cell is the progenitor cell in the bone marrow, and that it is CD34 positive. Now, the hematopoietic stem cell has the ability to produce a myeloid stem cell, or it can produce a lymphoid stem cell. The lymphoid stem cell has the ability to produce a B lymphoblast or a T lymphoblast, and the B lymphoblast can produce a naive B cell, and the T lymphoblast can produce the naive T cells. Of course, the naive B cells eventually will get trained to become plasma cells, and the naive T cells will eventually become trained to become CD8 positive T cells or CD4 positive T cells. So this is the normal hematopoiesis of the lymphoid half of this chart. Now let's go to the other side. Again, the hematopoietic stem cell has the ability to produce a myeloid stem cell, and the myeloid stem cell can develop into an erythroblast, which would then produce red blood cells, can develop into a myeloblast, which would then produce granulocytes, and the granulocytes are the neutrophils, basophils, and eosinophils. It can develop into a monoblast, which would eventually produce monocytes, or it can develop into a megakaryoblast, which would eventually produce megakaryocytes. Of course, we can draw a line here. This represents the myeloid half of the chart. So these are the myeloid cells, and these are the lymphoid cells. So this is normal hematopoiesis. Now, some of the problems that can occur with hematopoiesis is that we may get a circumstance in which we overproduce cells or underproduce cells or have a neoplastic proliferation of cells. And that's what really the remainder of this chapter is all about. Again, the cells mature as the hematopoietic stem cell begins to produce cells. The cells will eventually mature, and it's the mature cells that are released from the bone marrow into the blood. I think that's fairly obvious. The normal white blood cell count is about 5 to 10,000. If the white blood cell count is less than 5,000, we call that leukopenia. And if the white blood cell count is above 10,000, we call that leukocytosis. Now, what I'd like to establish here is that when a patient has a leukopenia or when they have a leukocytosis, the leukopenia or leukocytosis is usually predominantly due to one cell type. For example, one possibility is something called neutropenia. Neutropenia refers to a low number of circulating neutrophils. And this is classically seen with drug toxicity. The example would be chemotherapy. A classic conventional chemotherapy prohibits the division of cells, and it will affect both cancer as well as the rapidly dividing cells in the human body. And the hematopoietic stem cell and the bone marrow's progenitor cells are obviously rapidly dividing. And so it's not uncommon for patients on chemotherapy to actually develop a neutropenia. One of the pharmacologic tie-ins here is that such a neutropenia would be treated with GM-CSF or GCSF. GM-CSF, granulocyte monocyte colony stimulating factor, and GCSF is granulocyte colony stimulating factor. Both of these can be used pharmacologically to boost granulocyte production in a patient, for example, that is undergoing chemotherapy. And examiners like you to know that both GM-CSF and GCSF can be used to boost the neutrophil count. Another mechanism by which neutropenia can develop is severe infection. When we think about infection...
Hold on. I have to process what the fuck you just said. Hi, Miss Luna. Miss Luna's went out in the snow earlier. She did not like it. Okay. Miss Luna! Mwah.
We think about a high neutrophil count. However, if the infection is very severe, it is possible for the neutrophil count to decrease, and that's because most of the neutrophils would be out of the blood and in the tissue. Another example of a low white count could be due to lymphopenia, and lymphopenia would be a low number of circulating lymphocytes. Classic causes include immunodeficiency. Let's take, for example, DiGeorge syndrome. In DiGeorge syndrome, remember that the patients have a failure to develop the third and fourth pharyngeal pouch. And because they fail to develop the third and fourth pharyngeal pouch, they fail to develop their thymus, and therefore the T cells don't develop properly. And so these patients can actually have a lymphopenia. Another example of a lymphopenia would be a high cortisol state. Cortisol or corticosteroids induce apoptosis in lymphocytes, and so that would also produce a lymphopenia. For example, if a patient had Cushing syndrome in which there was a high amount of cortisol floating around in the serum, that high amount of cortisol will induce apoptosis of the lymphocytes. Autoimmune destruction can also result in a lymphopenia. The classic example would be a patient with lupus. Recall that patients with lupus often produce antibodies against cells within the blood. They can produce antibodies against the red blood cells, they can produce antibodies against the white blood cells, and they can also produce antibodies against the platelets. And so lupus would be one example in which we might see a patient who has lymphopenia. And finally, whole body radiation can also result in lymphopenia. And it's important to note, and examiners like you to know, that the most sensitive cell in the human body to radiation are the lymphocytes. When they get hit with radiation, they die very quickly. If you suspect in a patient exposure to whole body radiation, you could look at the lymphocytes and see whether there is lymphopenia, because that would be the first cell or one of the earliest cells to actually be damaged by the radiation. It is also possible to have an increase in our white blood cell count, and one example by which our white blood cell count might increase is neutrophilic leukocytosis. In neutrophilic leukocytosis, there is a high number of circulating neutrophils. And this goes back to the central principle of inflammation, which is that there are two driving forces for acute inflammation. Number one, bacterial infection. When there is a bacterial infection, the neutrophil count goes up, and therefore we would have a neutrophilic leukocytosis. At the same time, tissue necrosis can also result in a neutrophilic leukocytosis. As you will recall, I mentioned in the inflammation lectures that the two driving forces for acute inflammation are bacterial infection and tissue necrosis. So these two circumstances will result in a neutrophilic leukocytosis. Now, what I'd like to also highlight is that in these two circumstances, the bone marrow will be pushed to release as many granulocytes and neutrophils as possible. And so one way by which the bone marrow will respond is by releasing cells that are slightly immature relative to the mature neutrophils. This is called a left shift. And one of the high yield important points to recognize
Is that the same thing as band forms? I'm assuming.
concerning a left shift is that when immature or precursor neutrophils are released into the blood, those cells are characterized by decreased FC receptors. And of course, FC receptors are important because they help the neutrophil to recognize immunoglobulin, which is going to act as an opsonin for phagocytosis. So there's going to be a decreased expression of FC receptors in immature neutrophils, and they don't function quite as well as a mature neutrophil. Examiners also like you to know that CD16 is the marker for that decreased FC receptor. And so we could summarize it by saying that when patients have a left shift and immature neutrophils are released into the blood, those immature neutrophils are going to have decreased CD16, i.e. decreased FC receptor. And that is actually an important principle that shows up on examinations. Now,
Wait. Decreased FC receptors or CD16. Am I tripping, or is CD16 not natural killer cells? And CD56? CD16 marker. Oh. Okay, it is also not natural killer cells, neutrophils. Oh, okay. But I'm assuming CD56 is only natural killer cells. Probably.
Now, the third way by which we could develop a neutrophilic leukocytosis would be to have a high cortisol state. Now, remember from our discussions in inflammation that I mentioned that neutrophils exist in sort of two groups. One group that's floating around in the serum, and the other group that is called the marginated pool. And the marginated pool basically sits in the blood vessels, but is stuck to the endothelium, or the lining of the pulmonary vasculature, the vessels in the lung. So these neutrophils are sort of hanging out, almost like bats in a cave. When there is a high cortisol state, cortisol disrupts the ability for adhesion to occur. And when this disrupted adhesion occurs, this causes the adhesion to break and drops the neutrophils into the blood. And so patients who have a high cortisol state, they're actually going to get a high neutrophil count because the marginated pool is going to fall into the blood. And it's kind of interesting, if you give a patient steroids, the white blood cell count goes up. And again, that's because the steroids have disrupted the adhesion of the marginated pool, forcing the marginated pool of neutrophils to then fall into the blood, which would then increase the neutrophilic count, giving us a neutrophilic leukocytosis. Another possibility would be to get a monocytosis that would increase the white count. Monocytosis, very straightforward, is seen in chronic inflammatory states and is also seen in malignancy. Eosinophilia can also increase the white blood cell count. This is an increased number of circulating eosinophils, classically seen in allergic reactions, classically seen in parasitic infection. One very high yield association for eosinophilia is Hodgkin's lymphoma. In a subset of patients with Hodgkin's lymphoma, there is an increased number of eosinophils, both associated with the tumor and circulating around in the blood. And examiners like you to know that the mechanism by which this eosinophilia occurs is increased IL-5 production. So in the case of Hodgkin's lymphoma, the mechanism by which the eosinophilia occurs is increased IL-5 production. Basophilia refers to a high basophil count, and for all practical purposes, the one place that we're going to
Pause. Ms. Lunas, I need to write this.
see this is CML. Again, basophilia classically associated with CML, relatively high yield principle. Lymphocytic leukocytosis would be a high white blood cell count due to lymphocytes, and it's classically going to be seen in viral infections. Recall that viral infections are going to be fought and handled by the CD8 positive T cells. And so the CD8 positive T cells are the ones that are going to be present within the blood as they head towards the viral infection or are activated by the fact that there is a viral infection. And that would result in a lymphocytic leukocytosis. One interesting organism that can cause a lymphocytic leukocytosis is Bordetella pertussis. Now, obviously, this is a bacteria, and bacteria generally don't cause lymphocytic leukocytosis. Instead, we'd expect to see neutrophils, but this is the one exception, and because it's an exception, it's relatively high yield for examinations. This bacteria actually produces a special factor called lymphocytosis promoting factor. The lymphocytosis promoting factor blocks lymphocytes from leaving the blood to enter the lymph node. Now recall that lymphocytes are produced in the bone marrow, and then they go into the blood, and eventually they need to go to the lymph node in order to learn how to develop antibodies or to get stimulated to be able to fight infection. And so if the lymphocytes are blocked from entering into the lymph node, they'll actually be stuck in the blood, and if they're stuck in the blood, there'll be a lymphocytic leukocytosis. Here we get an opportunity, and I put it here because there really is no other place in the text to discuss it, but here we're going to take a little...
This is random, but I just realized I know like 4 different things that IM abbreviates. It's like, well, infectious mononucleosis is one, intramuscular is another one, internal medicine, and then you have IM from swimming. It's called IM, right? The one where you go butterfly back rest free. That's called the IM, right? There's probably another IM, like I don't know, I can't think of anything, but there's so many IMs. Okay, this isn't too long.
Diversion, and we're going to discuss infectious mononucleosis. Infectious mononucleosis is an EBV infection, most commonly, that results in a lymphocytic leukocytosis because we're dealing with a virus, so the lymphocytic leukocytosis would be fighting the virus, and that lymphocytic leukocytosis is comprised of reactive CD8 positive T cells. That makes sense. Again, EBV is the more common cause, CMV is a less common cause. The virus is transmitted by saliva, and in fact, this disease is also called kissing disease, and it classically affects teenagers. When an individual gets an EBV infection leading to infectious mononucleosis, there are 3 tissues that are going to be infected. The oropharynx will be infected, giving the patient a sore throat. The liver will be infected, giving the patient hepatitis, and EBV is an important cause of hepatitis, and the B cells will be infected. Now, in response to the infection, there will be a CD8 positive T cell response. Of course, if there's a virus, the virus will take over the genetic machinery of the cell. It will then express viral proteins on MHC class 1, and the CD8 positive T cells will recognize that MHC class 1. When there's a CD8 positive T cell response, that will result in a few things that will be apparent clinically. The patient will have generalized lymphadenopathy, i.e. the lymph nodes, multiple lymph nodes will become enlarged. It's important to know for the purposes of examinations, and they like to ask, which area of the lymph node will be enlarged. That requires a little bit of background. Remember that in a lymph node, we have a cortex, and we have a paracortex, and then we have a medulla. And in the cortex, the cortex is where the B cells live, and the paracortex is where the T cells live. And so when we have a EBV infection, an infectious mononucleosis, there's going to be hyperplasia of the paracortex. So it's important to know that in the case of generalized lymphadenopathy, the problem is going to be, or the area of expansion is going to be the paracortex. Again, that's a nice way to test normal histology.
Shit.
Also present in these patients will be splenomegaly. Why would we see splenomegaly? Well, remind ourselves that the spleen is made up of red pulp and white pulp. The red pulp contains blood, and the white pulp contains lymphoid tissue. Now, within the white pulp, there will be B areas and T cell areas, and the T cell area will be expanded in this particular circumstance. Important to note from normal histology, and again makes for a high yield examination question, exactly which area of the white pulp will be expanded, and that is the periarterial lymphatic sheath. Periarterial lymphatic sheath, also called the PALS. Recall from histology that if I draw you a picture of the spleen, there's red pulp and there's white pulp, and the red pulp looks red and the white pulp looks blue. It has a bunch of blue lymphocytic-like cells, and that within the white pulp you see these arteries, and the arteries have very dense blue around them. This is a classic histology, and this is called a periarterial lymphatic sheath, or the PALS. And it so happens that it's this area here where the T cells are present. And so this area around the vessels will be expanded, causing the entire spleen to become bigger, giving the patient splenomegaly. The third consequence of having a CD8 positive T cell response is that the patient will develop a high white count with atypical lymphocytes. Those atypical lymphocytes are actually CD8 positive T cells. Here's the atypical lymphocyte, and a few reasons why it's atypical. Number one, look at the nucleus. The nucleus here is much bigger than the adjacent red blood cells. Now that's a little bit abnormal because normally the lymphocyte of the nucleus is about the size of the red blood cell. So the nucleus is too large. At the same time, it has this abundant blue cytoplasm, which a lymphocyte usually doesn't have so much cytoplasm. So these are some important atypical features. Now when you see this cell, it almost looks like a monocyte. And in fact, if you think of the name infectious mononucleosis, initially we thought that these were monocytes, and so we called the disease infectious mononucleosis. However, we later learned that these are actually reactive T cells. So again, important to note that these cells are CD8 positive T cells. When a patient is suspected to have infectious mononucleosis, we screen for the disease via the monospot test. The monospot test is interesting because the basis of this test.
Hold on. So in mononucleosis, you don't have monocytosis, you have lymphocytic leukocytosis, which is the reactive CD8 positive cytotoxic cells. And it has nothing to do with monocytes. What the freak, man?
Is that it detects IgM heterophile antibodies. What are heterophile antibodies? Hetero means other and phile means loving. And see, these are antibodies that have an affinity to bind red blood cells from another animal. And so, for example, patients who have mono will develop IgM against sheep red blood cells or horse red blood cells. And it's these antibodies that can be detected using the monospot test. The monospot test usually turns positive within 1 week after infection. If it's negative, it could be that we tested too early, or it could be that the disease is actually due to CMV. So when the disease is due to CMV, then the monospot test is usually negative. And again, CMV is also an important cause of infectious mononucleosis, and examiners like to go after that. So patient who's got the classic signs and symptoms of infectious mononucleosis, but doesn't have EBV, think about CMV. We should also remember that the monospot test is merely a screening test. And a general principle in medicine is that every screening test must be followed by a confirmatory test. The confirmatory test for mononucleosis would be to prove that the patient has EBV, viral capsid antigen. Complications of infectious mononucleosis include an increased risk for splenic rupture. This is very high yield. Patients who get infectious mononucleosis get splenomegaly, and because there is splenomegaly, the capsule of the spleen can easily rupture. Generally speaking, or classically speaking, we would advise patients who have infectious mononucleosis to avoid all contact sports for the next year. And of course, examiners like to go after that principle. Additionally, if patients are exposed to penicillin who have infectious mononucleosis, they can develop a rash. And finally, the virus infects B cells and it can remain dormant within B cells. And the complication of this dormancy is actually twofold. First, it increases the risk for recurrence of infectious mononucleosis. And second, there is a risk in the future of development of lymphoma, especially if an immunodeficiency develops. Recall from our discussions in neoplasia that EBV is associated with an increased risk of lymphoma, and particularly in patients that are immunodeficient, for example, AIDS patients. Here's a picture of splenic rupture. And again, just to remind you,
Beautiful.
in patients with infectious mononucleosis, the spleen enlarges. And when the spleen enlarges, there's a risk of rupture. All patients with infectious mononucleosis are classically told to avoid contact sports for up to 1 year after resolution of the disease. And this closes off our discussion of leukocytosis and leukopenia, and we'll move on next to acute leukemia.
I just realized that when we were dissecting, I never really looked at the spleen, did I? The spleen is the left upper quadrant, right? Here. Am I remembering that right? Okay. Yeah, I never really saw it because I feel like it was like really deep in there, and then the abdomen anatomy lab was the worst lab of my fucking life. I hated that lab so bad. Okay. I have to pee, and I'm gonna take care of the litter robot because it seems to be malfunctioning really quick. So Mason? Miss Luna. Okay. That's done. Oh, jeez.
Welcome back. The next discussion that we're going to have concerns acute leukemia. However, before we can understand acute leukemia, we need to briefly review hematopoiesis. So let's remind ourselves that hematopoiesis begins with a hematopoietic stem cell, and that hematopoietic stem cell eventually develops into a myeloid blast or a lymphoid blast. The myeloid blast is also known as the myeloid stem cell. The lymphoid blast is also known as the lymphoid stem cell. And the myeloid blast eventually has the ability to produce multiple myeloid lineages. For example, it can develop into a erythroblast that would produce the red blood cells, and it can develop into a monoblast that would produce the monocytes. It can develop into a myeloblast, which would produce the granulocytes, and it can develop into a megakaryoblast that would produce the megakaryocytes. Similarly, the lymphoblast has the ability to eventually develop into a B lymphoblast, which would produce B cells, and a T lymphoblast, which would eventually produce T cells. Now, this stepwise maturation of the hematopoietic stem cell to a myeloid blast and eventually to red blood cells, etc., is constantly occurring. In an acute leukemia, the idea is that there is a disruption in the ability for the cells to mature, so that the myeloblast, for example, or the lymphoblast, for example, loses the ability to become a more mature cell, and when it loses the ability to become a more mature cell, this cell begins to pile up. And that's the hallmark of acute leukemia. As I've stated here in your text, acute leukemia is a neoplastic proliferation of blasts. Now, we should remember that if I were to take my bone marrow or your bone marrow and to look for blasts, I would see a certain percentage of blasts. In fact, 1 to 2% is the normal number. And the reason we see blasts within our bone marrow is because our bone marrow has blasts, and those blasts are the cells that are generating the more mature cells that will eventually be pushed off into the blood. So we need a strict definition for what exactly an acute leukemia is, and that definition is greater than 20% blasts in the bone marrow. When there are greater than 20% blasts in the bone marrow, that is defined as an acute leukemia. Now, in an acute leukemia, the blasts will crowd out normal hematopoiesis. And so the patients will classically present with signs and symptoms of loss of the cells that are normally produced by the bone marrow. For example, if there's a loss in red blood cells, the patient will develop anemia. If platelets can't be formed, the patient will develop thrombocytopenia. And if the neutrophils can't be formed, the patients will develop neutropenia. And so, of course, if they have anemia, they would present with signs and symptoms of hypoxia. If they have thrombocytopenia, they would present with signs and symptoms of bleeding. And if they have neutropenia, they would present with signs and symptoms of infection. But the notion here is that as these blasts begin to pile up within the bone marrow, they crowd out the normal hematopoiesis, resulting in the classic signs and symptoms. These signs and symptoms tend to be acute. The patients present all of a sudden with these signs and symptoms, and hence the term acute leukemia. At the same time, the blasts usually enter into the blood, and when they enter into the blood, they result in a high white blood cell count. If we were to look at these blasts on a blood smear or even on a bone marrow aspirate, we would see that the blasts are large, immature cells with a punched out nucleolus. I've included in your text a picture of a blast. A few important things. First of all, these are large cells. Here's the normal red blood cell. Clearly, these cells are much larger than the normal red blood cell. So one feature of a blast is that it is a large cell. It's relatively immature. It doesn't have much cytoplasm. And the third important feature, as I've already mentioned, is that there is a nucleolus. If you look at the nucleus of this cell, it appears as if someone took a hole puncher and punched out a little circular region of that nucleus. That represents the nucleolus, that punched out area. Now, when we have an acute leukemia, if I were to look at this blood smear, I could
Oh
clearly
my
identify these
God.
as blasts. However, I may not be able to tell you whether these
Miss
are
Luna just
lymphoblasts
took
or
the
whether these are myeloblasts.
stinkiest shit.
And so that requires a little bit of explanation. Again, remember
Miss
that the hematopoietic stem
Luna!
cell is going to divide into myeloid blast and a lymphoid
Jesus.
blast. Now, if there's an accumulation of the myeloid blast, that is called AML. And if there's an accumulation of the lymphoid blast, that is called ALL. When we look at a blast on a bone marrow aspirate or on a blood smear, it's important for us to be able to determine whether that cell represents a myeloblast or whether that cell represents a lymphoblast, because these are two very different diseases with very different treatments. By looking at the cell, it's very difficult to tell whether we're dealing with a myeloblast or a lymphoblast.
Oh
So
my
instead, we
God,
use certain
sneaky
markers.
girl.
The key marker, the hallmark marker for a lymphoblast is going to be positivity for TDT in the nucleus. TDT is a DNA
TDT.
polymerase, and it is present in the nucleus of lymphoblast and only in the nucleus of lymphoblast, meaning it's not present in mature lymphocytes and it's not present in the myeloid blast. And so TDT is the key marker that's going to identify for us that we're dealing with a lymphoblast. At the same time, one of the key markers for a myeloid blast, sort of the
This TDT thing is reminding me of calculus. Like fucking integrals and
classic
shit.
key marker for a myeloid blast is the presence of myeloperoxidase. Now, myeloperoxidase can be detected in two ways. The first way would be to do a chemical study to determine that this enzyme is present in the cytoplasm of the cells. And the second way would be to actually view the myeloperoxidase under the microscope. We can't see myeloperoxidase under the microscope. However, myeloperoxidase can sometimes crystallize into a special structure called an Auer rod. And so the presence of an Auer rod in a cell indicates that we
Auer
basically are
rod?
dealing with AML. Now, that's what I say here in your slides, that acute leukemia
Oh.
is subdivided into ALL and AML, and that's based on the phenotype of the blasts. ALL is a neoplastic accumulation of lymphoblasts, as I've already explained, and the key finding for a lymphoblast is going to be positivity for TDT. Again, when you have blasts, you want to decide whether it's a lymphoblast or a myeloid blast. TDT is a key marker because TDT indicates that you're dealing with a lymphoblast. It's important to know for examination purposes that TDT is a DNA polymerase, and obviously that DNA polymerase would be present within the nucleus. TDT, as I've already stated, is not present in myeloid blasts and is not present in mature lymphocytes, and so it's a very helpful marker. Of course, ALL most commonly arises in children. One very high yield association is that ALL can be associated with Down
What
syndrome,
do you mean, of
but
course?
after the age of 5, and that's going to be important a little later in our discussion. Patients who have Down syndrome can develop ALL, but usually it's after the age of 5. Now, ALL becomes a little more complicated in that it can be subclassified into BALL and TALL. Remember that the hematopoietic stem cell, if we look at the lymphoid lineage, will become a lymphoblast, and that lymphoblast will become a B lymphoblast or a T
Be all.
lymphoblast. And of course, the B lymphoblast will produce B cells, and the T lymphoblast will produce T cells. So what we're saying here is that when you have ALL, you can actually have a BALL or a TALL. And this is important because it also has some clinical ramifications. So as I say here, ALL can be subclassified into BALL and TALL, and we base that on surface markers. The way by which we make that distinction is surface markers. In other words, both BALL and TALL will have TDT positivity. That allows it to be called an ALL, but the surface markers will distinguish the two. So BALL is the most common type of ALL, and the key classical surface markers. The classical surface markers are CD10, CD19, and CD20. These are the classic markers seen in a BALL. BALL has an excellent response to chemotherapy, but it's important to remember that it
So
requires
ball and
prophylaxis
tall.
to the scrotum and the CSF. When we give
But ball
chemotherapy
is
to
more
these
common.
patients, the chemotherapy obviously goes into the blood, but is not able to properly cross the blood-brain barrier or the blood-testicle barrier. These are special sites that require chemotherapy to be directly injected within them. And so prophylactically, the patients will get chemotherapy to the scrotum and to the CSF. Here's a picture of the meninges of the brain. This represents the meninges, and all of this blue, all these blue dots within the meninges here, this all represents ALL. Again, I just put this picture here to remind you that patients who have ALL require prophylactic chemotherapy to the scrotum and to the CSF. The prognosis for BALL is generally good, and it's based on cytogenetic abnormalities. The classic BALL that we're all familiar with, that usually has cytogenetic abnormality of translocation between chromosomes 12 and 21, 12, 21, sort of 12 flipped over is 21, and this has a good prognosis. And this is the one that we more commonly see in kids. Now, there is another subtype of ALL in which patients can actually have a 922 translocation, and the 922 translocation has a poor prognosis. Now, remember that the 922 translocation is classic and is a defining feature of CML. However, it can also be seen in a subset of patients that have BALL, and this portends a poor prognosis.
Oh.
This is also known as pH-positive ALL. pH stands for the Philadelphia chromosome, so remember that the 922 translocation is also called the Philadelphia chromosome, and this subtype is more commonly seen in adults. TALL would be categorized by lymphoblasts, which are going to be TDT positive, that express a marker that ranges from the number CD2 up to CD8. For example, CD3, CD4, CD8, CD5, CD7. These are all markers of T-cell ALL. Important to note that the blasts do not express CD10. Now, TALL is very easy to remember because the T is sort of the mnemonic. So it presents as a thymic mass, and that makes sense because that's where the T cells normally would go. So it's going to be in the mediastinum, and it presents in a teenager. So thymic mass and teenager. At the same time, because it's a thymic mass instead of cells floating around in the blood, we call this acute lymphoblastic lymphoma instead of leukemia. Recall that leukemia means that the malignant cells would be floating around in the blood, and lymphoma, oma means mass, lymphoma means that the malignant cells are forming a mass. So we would call this disease acute lymphoblastic lymphoma because it would be classically forming a mass in the mediastinum. Moving on to AML, AML is a neoplastic accumulation of myeloblasts. And the myeloblasts, as I've already stated, would be characterized by myeloperoxidase. Myeloperoxidase can be detected in two ways. One way would be to chemically detect the myeloperoxidase using special stains, and the second way would be to visually see the myeloperoxidase as crystal aggregates called Auer rods. And so the presence of Auer rods within a blastic cell indicates that we're dealing with AML. Let's look at a picture. Here is a classic picture of a blast. This is a large cell, much bigger than the adjacent red blood cells, and you can notice here that there's a punched-out nucleolus. Along with this punched-out nucleolus, there is this structure present in the cytoplasm, which is an Auer rod, and this Auer rod indicates that the cell must be a myeloblast because an Auer rod is basically an aggregate of MPO. Now, AML is most commonly seen in older adults. The average age is about 55 years, and AML can be subclassified in three ways. One way would be to look at cytogenetic abnormalities, and this is the predominant mechanism by which we subclassify AML. So the first goal in an AML is to try to determine if there is a recurring cytogenetic abnormality. If we can't find a classic cytogenetic abnormality, the lineage of the myeloblast can also be used to subclassify AML. And finally, surface markers are often important in classifying AML as well. A classic type of AML is that AML which is characterized by a 15-17 translocation, and this is also known as acute promyelocytic leukemia. Very high yield to know that the 15-17 translocation results in disruption of the retinoic acid receptor. When this retinoic acid receptor is disrupted, this then disrupts the ability of the cells to mature. And so instead of maturing, promyelocytes will accumulate. The promyelocytes contain numerous Auer rods, and that's important because the Auer rods have the potential of activating the coagulation cascade, and so there is a risk for DIC. Acute promyelocytic leukemia is a medical emergency, and that's because of the risk of DIC. The treatment for acute promyelocytic leukemia is also very important to be aware of. If the patient is given ATRA, which is all trans-retinoic acid, it's a derivative of vitamin A, this will then bind the disrupted retinoic acid receptor and cause the blast to mature and to become neutrophils. And of course, that would alleviate the leukemic burden in that particular patient. So these are all very high yield principles. 15-17 translocation disrupts the retinoic acid receptor, causing promyelocytes to accumulate. The promyelocytes contain Auer rods. The Auer rods increase the risk for DIC. If ATRA is given, ATRA will then bind the retinoic acid receptor, causing the cells to mature and alleviating the patient of their leukemic burden. Now, recall that I said that if there is no recurring cytogenetic abnormality, then we subclassify the AML based on the lineage of differentiation. That requires us to review the lineage of differentiation briefly. Remember that we begin with a hematopoietic stem cell. The hematopoietic stem cell eventually becomes a myeloid stem cell, also called a myeloid blast. Now, this myeloid blast has the ability to produce an erythroblast, or a myeloblast, or a monoblast, or a megakaryoblast. And of course, each of these cells would then produce their relevant, mature offspring. Now, when we globally think about AML, we could get an AML that actually is composed of erythroblast. That's called an erythroblastic AML. We could get a monoblastic AML. We could get a megakaryobllastic AML, etc. And so when we don't have a recurring cytogenetic abnormality, we will subclassify the AML based on the lineage of differentiation of the cells. This actually results in a slightly complicated classification of leukemia. However, there are a few high-yield subtypes to be familiar with, and we're only going to touch on those. So one high-yield subtype to be familiar with is acute monocytic leukemia. What's characteristic of acute monocytic leukemia is that you get a proliferation of monoblasts. And what's very important and super high yield in this discussion is that these monoblastic characteristically infiltrate the gums so that the patients will present with involvement of the gums. And that's what this picture here is trying to highlight. This is a patient and they've got an acute monocytic or monoblastic leukemia, and clearly there is swelling of the gums.
Eesh.
Another important high yield subtype to be aware of is acute megakaryobllastic leukemia. This would be a proliferation of megakaryoblast. Megakaryoblast do not have MPO. Obviously, megakaryocytes don't need MPO because they're not going to be doing the oxygen-dependent killing that MPO is useful for. And so megakaryoblast would lack MPO, but what's even more important than that is that there's an association with Down syndrome, but before the age of 5. So this then brings us to a general principle. Patients with Down syndrome have an increased risk of acute leukemia. The acute leukemia is more commonly acute megakaryobllastic leukemia before the age of 5 and is more commonly ALL after the age of 5. So we should put that association together based on what we've learned.
Wait. Patients with Down syndrome have an increased risk for leukemia, but if it's before, then it's acute megakaryobllastic leukemia, and then if it's after 5, and it's ALL. Lymphoblastic. Okay. I hear screaming outside. Sometimes I'm like laying in bed at night and then I think, damn, did I lock the door or not? Because I always forget to lock the door. And then I get videos on TikTok of like, don't forget to lock your doors at night because this happened to me last night. And then it's like ring footage of like some guy walking around trying to get into people's places with a knife. And I'm like, wow, like someone could just walk in my place right now and like stab me while I'm asleep. And then I'm like too lazy to actually get up and check. So I just fall asleep with the anxiety. But hey, last night I thought that, and then I checked this morning and my doors were locked. So yay. What the fuck was I even writing? But I don't know, I feel like there's not really a high chance that someone would go around trying to murder people here in Lubbock. I don't know. Though there was that guy that died in my apartment.
Through this
Surely it
function.
was an accident, though.
It is also possible to get an AML from pre-existing dysplasia, and the classic circumstance in which there would be pre-existing dysplasia would be in a patient that has a history of exposure to alkylating agents, for example, chemotherapy or radiotherapy. Now, what happens in these patients is that they tend to develop something called a myelodysplastic syndrome. In a myelodysplastic syndrome, the patients get a hypercellular bone marrow, but because the cells are not being formed properly, dysplastic, bad growth, they actually don't get out into the blood, and so the patients have cytopenias, low counts of cells in the blood. In this particular case, if you were to do a bone marrow biopsy, you would see increased blasts. However, those increased blasts would be less than 20%. Of course, greater than 20%, we would not call it myelodysplastic syndrome, we would call it acute leukemia. Most of these patients, because they have cytopenias, will actually die from infection or bleeding, but a subset of them can progress to acute leukemia, such that if the blasts become greater than 20%, then we would say that the patient has, for example, AML that has arisen in a background of myelodysplasia. So that concludes our discussion of acute leukemia, and the next discussion will then be chronic leukemia.
Bro, what's with pathoma videos? And that concludes this module, and that concludes our lecture. Like, Boards and Beyond also does the same fucking thing. That just like built in. I miss Jink. But damn, am I glad when I hear that. Oh my god. I'm getting so sleepy again. Oh. It's just like so much information that it's so boring. Like, I can't pay attention. Actually, let me get lip balm because there's a cat under me. Is that you, kiddo? I'm sorry. I didn't know you were there. Okay, yes, pets. Yes. Kiddo. Yes, pets. You don't want cuddles? See if Kuro wants cuddles. Gotta get into my position. So, he likes to cuddle if I have my legs crisscrossed with a blanket on top. And that's when he'll cuddle. So let's see. Kiddo. Kiddo, cuddles? Come. Yes. Come. Good boy. Told ya. You fat cat. You are so fat. Okay. Chronic leukemia.
Okay, chronic leukemia. That's the next section of this
Yippee.
chapter. Before we can understand chronic leukemia, we need to just quickly review normal hematopoiesis. Obviously, we begin with a CD34 positive stem cell, as I've stated many times in the prior lectures. That can become a myeloid stem cell or a lymphoid stem cell, and the myeloid stem cell will produce cells of the myeloid lineage, and the lymphoid stem cell will produce cells of the lymphoid lineage. Now, when we talk about a chronic leukemia globally, what we're really referring to is a proliferation of mature lymphocytes. So if there's a neoplastic proliferation in which there are mature lymphocytes floating around in the blood, we call that a chronic leukemia. Again, I've highlighted that here by reminding you that chronic leukemia is a neoplastic proliferation of mature circulating lymphocytes. That's going to result in a high white blood cell count. Now, classically, this disease is insidious in onset. The patients present very slowly and they're often asymptomatic, and they can live a very long time with this disease. Again, it's classically seen in older adults. The prototypic chronic leukemia is chronic lymphocytic leukemia, or CLL. It's a neoplastic proliferation of naive B cells. Naive B cells are the B cells that have just been born from the bone marrow. And one of the characteristic findings is that these cells co-express CD5 and CD20. Very important to know for examinations. CD5 is a marker that would normally be expected to be present on a T cell, but in this particular case, it's aberrantly expressed on this B cell. And so this is a characteristic finding, co-expression of CD5 and CD20. If you were to look at the blood smear in these patients, there would be increased numbers of lymphocytes with something called SMUD cells, which I'll highlight in a moment. Here is a blood smear showing the increased number of lymphocytes, and in addition, notice that there is this splattered cell up here in the corner, as if someone took their thumb and smashed it or threw it against the slide, and that's called a SMUD cell, and SMUD cells are classically seen in CLL. Now, the lymphocytes of CLL can also do what lymphocytes normally do, and that is they can go to the lymph nodes. And so when CLL goes to the lymph node, that will cause generalized lymphadenopathy. At the same time, because the cells now involve the lymph node and are producing a mass, we'll actually call involvement of the lymph node small lymphocytic lymphoma. Again, OMA referring to mass. Some of the complications of CLL are that the patients will develop hypogammaglobulinemia. Now, the cells of CLL are neoplastic B cells. Normally, a B cell's goal in life would be to become a plasma cell and secrete immunoglobulin. However, these are neoplastic cells. They have no desire to do anything beneficial, and so they are not going to produce immunoglobulin. And as these cells take over the patient's body, there will be a hypogammaglobulinemia, i.e. a low immunoglobulin level within the blood. And that's important to note because the most common cause of death in these patients is actually infection. Another complication of CLL is autoimmune hemolytic anemia. Not only will these cells not make very much immunoglobulin, but if they happen to try to make immunoglobulin, they do a very bad job. And as a consequence, they actually produce antibody against the patient's own red blood cells. And so that's the way I think about autoimmune hemolytic anemia being a complication of CLL. The third complication that I've listed here is transformation to diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. Patients who have CLL that involves the lymph nodes will obviously have SLL or small lymphocytic lymphoma, and so they'll have a generalized lymphadenopathy. If the patient, it is possible for those cells to actually pick up additional mutations and eventually transform to a diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. The classic presentation in this particular case would be that the patient would present with an enlarging lymph node or an enlarging spleen. And the reason that the lymph node would be enlarging would be because they've now got a more aggressive tumor, and that tumor is rapidly growing, enlarging the tissue. So this is an important complication to be aware of as well. Another chronic leukemia would be hairy cell leukemia. This is a neoplastic proliferation of mature B cells, and they're characterized by hairy cytoplasmic processes. One of the very important features of these cells that also helps to make the diagnosis is that the cells are positive for an enzyme called tartrate-resistant acid phosphatase. Here's a classic image of hairy cell leukemia. Again, these are the neoplastic cells, and you can clearly see that these neoplastic cells have these hairy cytoplasmic processes coming off them, and that's one feature of hairy cell leukemia. You can then do a trap stain, tartrate-resistant acid phosphatase, to prove that indeed these cells represent hairy cell leukemia. Hairy cell leukemia's clinical features include splenomegaly. The spleen becomes big. Now, this is a very common feature in most chronic leukemias in the sense that when you have a chronic leukemia, the cells are going to go to lymph node and to lymphoid tissues. And so generally speaking, with chronic leukemias, the lymph nodes will become big and the spleen will become big. Normally, however, we would expect the spleen to become big due to expansion of the white pulp, which is where the white blood cells normally live. However, in this case, the splenomegaly is due to expansion of the red pulp, and that is particularly high yield. At the same time, it's important to note that these patients usually lack lymphadenopathy. Finally, if you were to do a bone marrow aspiration on these patients, you would get a dry tap because the bone marrow is often fibrosed in these patients. I sort of put this entire story together by simply remembering the word TRAP. TRAP, tartrate-resistant acid phosphatase, helps me to remember the chemical reaction that is classic for hairy cell leukemia. It also helps me to remember that the cells get trapped in the red pulp, and they get trapped in the bone marrow. And because they're trapped in the red pulp and trapped in the bone marrow, they can't go to the place where I would normally expect them, which would be in the lymph node, because I would expect most chronic leukemias would actually cause expansion of the lymph node or enlargement of the lymph node, and here we don't see that. So I use the word trap to really help me remember most of the clinical features of hairy cell leukemia. Very high yield to note that there is an excellent response of hairy cell leukemia to a drug called 2-CDA. The reason why examiners like to go after this is because it is a adenosine deaminase inhibitor. If we inhibit adenosine deaminase, adenosine will accumulate to toxic levels in neoplastic B cells. Recall from biochemistry that adenosine deaminase is actually part of the purine degradation pathway. If we block adenosine deaminase, then obviously adenosine would accumulate, which would then result in death of the neoplastic B cells. Another important chronic leukemia to be familiar with is ATLL, adult T-cell leukemia lymphoma. This is a neoplastic proliferation of mature CD4 positive T cells, classically associated, very high yield, with HTLV1, human T-cell leukemia virus 1. And this virus is particularly seen in Japan and in the Caribbean, and that is important to know as well. Clinically, these patients present with rash. I can tell you one general principle of T-cell leukemias is that they like to go to skin and create a rash. Also, the patient will have generalized lymphadenopathy with hepatosplenomegaly. There's nothing special here. We know that mature lymphocytes like to go to lymph node and like to go to spleen, and so we would expect to see lymphadenopathy and hepatosplenomegaly. Finally, what is important and very high yield is that these patients get lytic bone lesions with hypercalcemia. The reason why I think this is so high yield is because if I were to tell you that a patient has lytic bone lesions, you would automatically think about maybe something like multiple myeloma. And so for the knee-jerk reaction when we have lytic bone lesions with hypercalcemia, for example, punched out lesions in the bone with hypercalcemia, especially in the discussion of white blood cells, is to think about multiple myeloma. However, patients with adult T-cell leukemia lymphoma can also have lytic bone lesions with hypercalcemia. And in addition, one of the helpful features is that there will also be a rash. So that if on an examination, they tell you that there are lytic bone lesions with hypercalcemia and a rash, take a step back. Don't think about choosing multiple myeloma until you've excluded adult T-cell leukemia lymphoma. Mycosis fungoides is another sort of chronic leukemic process in which the patients get a neoplastic proliferation of mature CD4 positive T cells. Again, mature CD4 positive T cells like to go to skin, and so the cells will infiltrate the skin and they produce a rash or plaques or nodules, usually multiple throughout the body. If a biopsy was performed, we would see these neoplastic T cells in the epidermis, and it's very important to know that these are called Potrier microabscesses. So if the patient's got accumulation of neoplastic T cells in the epidermis, we call that a Potrier microabscess. The cells can also spread to the blood. When they spread to the blood, we call that Sézary syndrome. And the most important thing about Sézary syndrome is that when we look at the cells under the microscope, they have a classic appearance of cerebriform nuclei. Here's a picture of Sézary syndrome. And if you look at this nucleus, it sort of looks like there's a bunch of lobes to this nucleus, almost like the brain, because we can see little folding in between those lobes. So you can kind of see this line here, for example, kind of looks like the folds or the creases when you look at the brain. And so they call these cerebriform nuclei. And they are a classic finding in Sézary syndrome. And that concludes the section on chronic leukemia.
So sleepy. Oh. One more. One more video today. How many do we have tomorrow? There's 6.9. Okay, so it's those 2 videos and then another 2 videos. Yay, sketchy. Yeah, I'm glad this was a 3-week exam because I need that extra week. I'm so behind. 20 minutes.
The last of the leukemic processes that we're going to discuss are the myeloproliferative disorders. In order to understand the myeloproliferative disorders, we've got to go back to normal hematopoiesis. So recall that in normal hematopoiesis, there is a CD34 positive stem cell, and that stem cell can produce a myeloid stem cell or a lymphoid stem cell.
Bro.
The myeloid stem cell will eventually become the cells of the myeloid lineage, producing red blood cells, granulocytes, monocytes, and megakaryocytes. And the lymphoid stem cell has the ability to eventually produce the B cells and the T cells. If there is an accumulation of precursors of the myeloid lineage, then we call that acute myelogenous leukemia. If there is an accumulation of cells of the immature lymphoid lineage, then we call that ALL. If there is a accumulation of mature lymphoid cells, for example, T cells or B cells, then we would call that chronic leukemia, and there's subtypes that we've already discussed in the previous section. Now, if there is a neoplastic accumulation of mature myeloid cells, then we call that a myeloproliferative disorder. And of course, the myeloproliferative disorders will be subcategorized based on...
Wait. That's a good big picture. Let me go back to the chart. Okay, so... let's color code this. Okay. So neoplastic proliferation of the myeloid stem cells, or the immature myeloid cells. All the blasts is AML. Neoplastic proliferation of the lymphoblast is ALL. And the mature lymphocytes, that's chronic leukemia, CL. And then the mature myelocytes, that is, oh my god, myeloproliferative disorders. Okay.
Which cell is predominantly produced. So for example, if the red cells are overproduced, we call that polycythemia vera. If the granulocytes are overproduced, we call that CML,
that's what that
or
is.
chronic myelogenous leukemia. If the megakaryocytes are overproduced, or the platelets of the megakaryocytes are overproduced, we call that essential thrombocythemia. And so this is the general paradigm of the myeloproliferative disorders. Now, I'd like to make one thing very clear before we move forward, and that is that in a myeloproliferative disorder, you actually get neoplastic accumulation of everybody. So everybody's increased. The red blood cells will be increased, the granulocytes will be increased, the platelets will be increased. However, we name it based on the predominant cell. So for example, if there's an increase in red blood cells predominantly, we call that P vera. However, in polycythemia vera, there will also be an increase in neutrophils, basophils, and eosinophils, and there could also be an increase in platelets, for example, as well. This then takes us to your text, which basically states many of the things that I've already mentioned. What is a myelodysplastic syndrome? A neoplastic proliferation of mature cells of the myeloid lineage. It's a disease of late adulthood, and it results in a high white blood cell count with a hypercellular marrow. Now, the white blood cell count is going to go up because there's going to be an increased production of granulocytes, and the granulocytes are counted in the white blood cell count. So I hope that that's clear. Cells of all of the myeloid lineages will be increased, as I've already mentioned, and it's classified based on the dominant myeloid cell produced, as I've already explained. Generally speaking, there are some complications that are common. There's going to be an increased risk for hyperuricemia and gout. The notion here is that when you're developing a ton of these cells, you're also going to be turning over a ton of these cells. For example, let's say that the patient has polycythemia vera. In that particular syndrome, they overproduce red blood cells. Obviously, every time you produce a red blood cell, you're producing a nucleus, and that nucleus has to be removed. Remember that the red blood cells have their nucleus removed. So every time the nucleus is removed and the nucleus is degraded, that's going to result in activation of the purine degradation pathway, and the end result of the purine degradation pathway is uric acid. So these patients can easily develop hyperuricemia and gout. Same thing with CML. There's going to be an overproduction of granulocytes. Those granulocytes will eventually die and their nuclear material will need to be turned over, and it's the degradation of the purines that's going to result in hyperuricemia and a risk of gout. Another complication is that they can progress to marrow fibrosis. This is called the spent phase or the burnt out phase. Third complication is that many of the myelodysplastic syndromes can transform to acute leukemia. You've got mutations in a stem cell that allows the stem cell to develop and produce mature cells. However, if those mutations were to progress, you could easily arrest the stem cell in the blast phase, resulting in an acute leukemia. The first of these is CML, or chronic myeloid leukemia. This is a neoplastic proliferation of mature myeloid cells, as I've already explained. However, the predominant cell are granulocytes. One characteristically increased granulocyte are the basophils. And this is very important. If you recall from the very first lecture that I gave in this chapter, when we see basophilia, it's highly associated with chronic myeloid leukemia. And you're going to see why this is important in a few minutes as well. If we have a slide and we're looking at chronic myeloid leukemia, what we're going to see is an increase in the granulocytes. So all of these are clearly granulocytes. And we might even see some early precursor granulocytes within the blood. And then characteristically, as we can see off here in the corner, there's also going to be an increase in basophils within the blood, or a basophilia. CML is driven by a 922 translocation. And this 922 translocation results in a fusion between BCR and ABL. And this fusion results in an increased tyrosine kinase activity. The increased tyrosine kinase activity then drives the overproduction of the neoplastic cells. Recall that tyrosine kinase is a signal transducer. It is an oncogene that has the ability to transduce the signal of growth to the nucleus, and so overexpression of tyrosine kinase would result in overgrowth. The first line of treatment is imatinib, and imatinib basically blocks the excessive tyrosine kinase activity. It's a designer drug that has been designed to specifically block this increased tyrosine kinase activity. In these patients, splenomegaly is common. In fact, you can divide CML into three phases. There's the chronic phase, the accelerated phase, and then finally the transformation phase where they develop acute leukemia. Now, in the chronic phase, they have an enlarged spleen, and that's common. If there is an enlarging spleen, that is that the spleen is actually becoming bigger, then that is a marker of the accelerated phase, indicating that the patient's disease is getting worse. And it usually heralds the transformation to an acute leukemia, which would be the worst complication that could arise from CML. Transformation to an acute leukemia, when it occurs, can result in either AML or ALL. And this is a very important principle in understanding CML. So I'd like to take a moment to highlight something. Remember that we've got a hematopoietic stem cell, and this hematopoietic stem cell can develop into the myeloid lineage, or it can develop into the lymphoid lineage. And one of the cells of the myeloid lineage are the granulocytes, and it's predominantly the granulocytes that are increased in CML. Now, when you think about where the mutation is in this particular disease, the mutation must be in a stem cell, because the stem cell is the one that has the ability to produce more and more granulocytes. So the mutation could either be here, in that this cell is mutated and is overproducing the granulocytes, or the mutation could be up here, in that this cell is mutated, it's overproducing the myeloid blast, and then the myeloid blast is overproducing the granulocytes. And if I asked you where is the mutation, the answer would be that the mutation is up here. And that is why when patients actually develop a transformation to acute leukemia, they can develop a transformation where they begin to pile up these cells, which would result in an AML, or they could develop a transformation where they begin to pile up these cells, which would result in an ALL. And that's a very important principle to remember, that patients who have CML can transform to either AML or to ALL. Another high-yield discussion concerns distinguishing CML from a leukomoid reaction. This is a very interesting discussion. It's a way that examiners like to play the game. It's a way that you might encounter a patient clinically. So let's briefly take a moment to review. When we look at the blood smear of CML, what we're seeing is a bunch of increased granulocytes and some early precursors of those granulocytes. Now, if I were to look at that smear, my differential diagnosis would be acute infection or CML. Acute infection, because remember that infection is going to result in the overproduction of granulocytes, and the overproduction of granulocytes would then result in a high white blood cell count. So if I see a high white blood cell count and it's predominantly granulocytes, I can ask the question, is this due to infection, i.e. a leukomoid reaction, or is this due to CML, which would be a neoplastic proliferation? And there's three key ways by which I can make that distinction. The first way I can make that distinction is to look at an enzyme called leukocyte alkaline phosphatase. Leukocyte alkaline phosphatase is an enzyme present in the secondary granules of granulocytes. And leukocyte alkaline phosphatase is an enzyme that's useful for the purposes of inflammation. Now, cells that are arising due to an inflammatory process, a leukomoid reaction, would be leukocyte alkaline phosphatase positive. And that makes sense because those cells are being generated to fight an infection. However, cells of CML, which are neoplastic, have no intention of fighting infection. They're basically having a party, a neoplastic party, and so they would be LAP negative. So it's very important to know that the CML granulocytes are leukocyte alkaline phosphatase negative, as opposed to those in a reactive condition like inflammation, in which case the leukocyte alkaline phosphatase would be positive. Another important distinction would be the presence of basophils. If the patient has an infection and gets a high white count with a left shift and has a predominant neutrophilic leukocytosis as a reactive phenomena, the basophils will not go up. The basophils go up in CML, and that's why I've stated a couple times now so far that basophilia is highly associated with CML. The third way that we could make this distinction is to simply look for the translocation. In a reactive leukomoid reaction where we have a high white count with neutrophils due to infection, there would be no 922 translocation. If the 922 translocation is present, it is a defining feature of CML. The next disease that we want to discuss is polycythemia vera. Now, the idea here is that, again, you have a neoplastic proliferation of mature myeloid cells, especially the red blood cells. However, the granulocytes would be up, raising the white count, and the platelets would also be up. Very important that this particular disease is driven by JAK2 kinase mutation. That's super high yield for examinations, often shows up. JAK2 kinase mutation is what drives polycythemia vera. Clinically, the patients are going to get symptoms of hyperviscosity. Now, the idea here is that the blood gets loaded with red blood cells and becomes super thick. And so when it becomes super thick, there's a hyperviscosity to the blood, which then can create certain clinical findings. For example, the patients get blurry vision and headache due to the high hyperviscosity of the blood. There's also an increased risk of venous thrombosis. And can you remind me from chapter 1 of our discussion, what's a classic venous thrombosis that could arise in these patients? Very high yield for examinations. Budd-Chiari syndrome. Budd-Chiari syndrome is when you get a thrombosis in the hepatic vein, which then results in infarction of the liver. And the most common cause of Budd-Chiari syndrome is polycythemia vera. Another complication would be a flushed face. The blood can congest within blood vessels due to its hyperviscosity, resulting in a flushing of the face. And finally, these people get itching after bathing. And the reason they get itching is because along with the red blood cells, they also have extra mast cells. So one of the cells that's particularly increased in polycythemia vera are the mast cells. Now, the mast cells are loaded with histamine, and it so happens that when patients bathe, that can actually set off the mast cells to release their histamine, which then results in itching after bathing. It's a very classic symptom, especially, again, on examinations. The treatment of polycythemia vera is to decrease the red blood cell mass, and we do that by phlebotomy. Without treatment, death would usually occur within a 1-year period. A second-line treatment is hydroxyurea. One of the important states that needs to be distinguished from polycythemia vera is reactive polycythemia. Basically, the idea here is that if we have an increased red blood cell mass, the increased red blood cell mass or count could be due to a reactive condition. For example, let's say that the patient has lung disease, and because they have lung disease, they have hypoxia. And so if they have hypoxia, the SaO2 would be low, and as a result, erythropoietin production would be increased. And so if the patient has a reactive polycythemia due to lung disease, then we would expect that the SaO2 would be low, and that the erythropoietin, which is driving that reactive polycythemia, would be increased. Another way that we could get a reactive polycythemia would be if we had a tumor that ectopically produced erythropoietin. And the tumor that does that is renal cell carcinoma. That's high yield. So a tumor, for example, renal cell carcinoma, could ectopically produce erythropoietin, and in that case, the erythropoietin would be high, which would be driving that high red blood cell count, but the SaO2 would be normal because there is no hypoxemia in the patient. Of course, in polycythemia vera, there's no problem with oxygenation, and so the SaO2 is normal, and the erythropoietin would actually be decreased due to a negative feedback. There are so many red blood cells that the erythropoietin levels are decreased. And so this is very important to understand how to distinguish polycythemia vera from reactive polycythemia. Another of the myelodysplastic syndromes is essential thrombocythemia. In this particular disease, there's a neoplastic proliferation, again, of mature myeloid cells. However, the key cells are platelets. Red blood cells would be up, and granulocytes would also be increased, but the key cell are the platelets, also associated with a JAK2 kinase mutation, very high yield to be familiar with. Here's what the blood smear would look like in essential thrombocythemia. You've got a ton of platelets. Another circumstance that could result in a very similar pattern would be iron deficiency anemia. Iron deficiency anemia can also have a lot of platelets associated with it. And so when we have a lot of platelets, we want to think about the possibility of essential thrombocythemia, but in the back of our mind, we should also think about the possibility of iron deficiency anemia. The symptoms of essential thrombocythemia will either be increased risk of bleeding or thrombosis. Basically, either the platelets will not be functioning, giving you an increased risk of bleeding, or the platelets will be over-functioning, increasing the risk for thrombosis. Now, most of the myelodysplastic syndromes have the ability to eventually burn out, and they would result in marrow fibrosis. However, this disease rarely goes to marrow fibrosis. Most of the myeloproliferative disorders have the ability to develop into acute leukemia. This disease rarely develops into acute leukemia. What is particularly important is that there is no significant risk for hyperuricemia or gout. Now recall that in most of the myelodysplastic syndromes, there is an increased risk for hyperuricemia and gout because you're turning over a ton of cells. So again, in P. vera, you're making a ton of red blood cells. Those red blood cells will have their nucleus removed before they get put into the blood, and so that nucleus will have to be broken down, and if we're going to break down nucleus, we're going to go through the purine degradation pathway, and the end result of the purine degradation pathway would be uric acid, giving you hyperuricemia. However, in the case of essential thrombocythemia, remember that how do platelets develop? If this is the megakaryocyte, the way by which the platelets develop is that they are actually just pieces of megakaryocyte cytoplasm, and the platelet really doesn't have a nucleus. And so when these platelets are being overproduced, there is no excess turnover of nuclear material because it's just pieces of cytoplasm. And so there is no significant risk for hyperuricemia or gout. The fourth of the myelodysplastic syndromes is myelofibrosis. In this particular case, we get a neoplastic proliferation of mature myeloid cells, particularly the megakaryocytes, again, driven by a JAK2 kinase mutation. The megakaryocytes produce excess platelet-derived growth factor, and that platelet-derived growth factor then results in marrow fibrosis, which creates the classic myelofibrosis that we base the name of this disease on. Here's a picture highlighting the myelofibrosis. This is a spicule of bone, and we can clearly see that there's way too much fibrosis, pink collagen, deposited within this marrow space. All we should really expect to see in the marrow space is fat and bone marrow elements. However, here we're seeing a ton of fibrosis, and so this is the classic finding in myelofibrosis on biopsy. Clinical features of myelofibrosis include splenomegaly. Now, the idea here is that once the bone marrow is fibrosed, hematopoiesis can no longer properly occur in the bone marrow. And so the stem cells basically remember, or basically go back to the place where they used to make blood in the fetus, which was in the spleen or in the liver, resulting in extramedullary hematopoiesis.
What
Now,
was
at the same
that?
time, because there's massive extramedullary hematopoiesis, the patients develop something called a leukoerythroblastic smear. And the idea here is the following. When blood cells are made in the bone marrow contains reticulin gates. What are the reticulin gates? They prohibit cells that are immature from actually exiting into the blood. So if these are the cells being developed over here, they won't exit into the blood until they're small enough to pass through these gates, which are basically made of a molecule called reticulin. In the spleen, when extramedullary hematopoiesis occurs, especially in massive amounts, we won't be able to prohibit immature cells from leaving the spleen. And so we get something called a leukoerythroblastic smear. Leuko referring to the white cells, erythro referring to the red cells, blastic referring to an increased number of immature cells in the blood. In association with the leukoerythroblastic smear, we would also see nucleated red blood cells. The other finding that's important to note is that these patients will have an increased risk of infection, thrombosis, and bleeding. Now, why would they have an increased risk of infection, thrombosis, and bleeding? Well, basically, the bone marrow is no longer able to properly produce your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and your platelets. And the vast majority of hematopoiesis is now shifted over to the spleen. However, the spleen is tiny compared to the entire bone marrow space. So the patients, although they are producing some extramedullary hematopoiesis, it's nowhere near what they actually need. And so there's an increased risk of infection, thrombosis, and bleeding. Here is a picture of a teardrop cell. And the reason why I included this in your text is to remind you that in myelofibrosis, there's also an increased risk of developing teardrop cells. The way I think about this is that although most of the hematopoiesis moves to the spleen, some of the hematopoiesis does remain within the bone marrow. And you can imagine that if this is the bone marrow and the bone marrow is totally fibrosed and there's a little bit of hematopoiesis occurring, as the red blood cells are generated in this fibrosis, they'll be stretched as they try to leave to get out into the blood. And when they're stretched, they'll be squeezed into these teardrop shapes. And so this slide I included here to remind you of what a teardrop cell looks like and to also alert you to the fact that teardrop cells are commonly seen in myelofibrosis. And that concludes our discussion of myeloproliferative disorders.
Oh my god, no way. I was so ready to go on to lymphadenopathy. We made it! Yay! Oh, God. So, here's the thing. I want to make flashcards for everything, but I also want to stay on track with content, and I don't know if I could keep up if I were to spend time making flashcards. Because, okay, let's say tomorrow I take about 2 hours to watch the videos. Then let's say I take 4 hours to make cards for those videos. Because, yeah, making the cards is probably longer than actually watching the videos. But then I also have to make cards for the 4 other days of content that I still haven't made cards from. But the thing is, I don't like using pre-made cards. They just like, there's like a way I like to do things that I feel like is just more efficient for me if I want to go through the cards in the exact way I want to. Like, there's something about making your own cards where it's a little bit more efficient in the way that like you're only making cards over things that you personally don't know. Like, I can exclude cards that I already know, you know? Or like I can make cards that will ask the question in a way that I can answer very quickly instead of like other people's cards where I have to like, I don't know. But do I have time to do that though? We can see. Because the reason why I want to make the cards is that so I have one single resource of space repetition review instead of having to switch between like these cards that I made here and then like the other deck of cards from USMLE RX and whatever. Yes, catnip, kiddo. You drug addicts. But I guess like the thing with making them is that in making them, it's like I'm also reviewing everything as I go. We'll just start making them and then I'll probably split my time between doing the videos, like actually watching them. Like I should at least watch the videos on the days that they're due and then make them. I'll set an amount of time to make the cards and then another amount of time just to do the cards that I've already made and then just like catch up as I go. I don't know. Fuck, I wish I had more time, man. I wish. Okay, we gotta start chapter. Okay, not that. Let's start chapter 4. Oh, chapter 4. Yeah, because I think the last. Bro. Yeah, I freaking unsubscribed from Anki Hub or whatever, so that shit keeps showing up. Okay. I'm gonna put this here. Oh. Okay. We gotta make cards starting from day 2 shit. Dear God. Where did I stop? Start the ITP. What, kiddo? Kiddo wants to cuddle. Okay, get into position. Kiddo, where'd he go? Kiddo, come on. Come. Yes, Cuddles. Come on. You big fat boy. Come. Come on. Here you go. He just be making biscuits. Hi, kiddo. You sweet boy. Sweet, sweet boy. Move this closer so I can actually type. Bro, my handwriting is just so yuck. These days. I mean, not all the time. Did I do this yet? You know what? Fuck it. I don't care anymore. Let's see. Microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. Pathologic. Platelet. Microthrombi. Vessels. Oop. Cody, you kind of stink. Hmm? You're kind of stinky. Diagnostic feature. Microangiopathic hemolytic anemia is seen in thrombotic, thrombocytopenic purpura, TPP, and hemolytic uremic syndrome. Oh. That's a future card. TTP is due to decreased atom TS13, an enzyme that normally cleaves von factor. Goddamn. This cell is a schistocyte or helmet cell and indicates microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. God damn it. TTP. Large uncleaved multimers lead to abnormal platelet adhesion, resulting in microthrombi. To decreased atom TS13. Autoantibody most commonly seen in adult females. Microthrombi. HUS is due to endothelial damage by drugs or infection. HUS is classically seen in children with E. coli 0157H7 dysentery, which results from exposure to undercooked beef. E. coli barotoxin damages endothelial cells. Clinical findings of HUS TTP, microangiopathic hemolytic skin and mucosal bleeding. Oh. Well, I guess I should take that out. Fever. Renal insufficiency, more common HUS. Thrombi involve vessels, kidney, sinus abnormalities, more common in TTP. So I'll stop there for now. Age range. Skin and mucosal bleeding, fever. Oh. Shit. Can't really see. Kuro's napping in my lap. Oh, he's so fat. My legs are starting to get numb. Qualitative platelet disorders. might end the stream soon just because this is kind of the boring part of things. We might take a shower and like just chill, make the rest of these flashcards in bed or something, and hope I don't fall asleep. So, and my legs are kind of getting numb because Kuro is fat as fuck.
Kuro, you were too fat, Kuro.
Okay. He is too fat.
Kuro, you are so fat. You're like the size of 2 cats combined. Hmm?
Don't know if you could see him. Maybe?
Kuro is so fat. So fat and fluffy and stinky. Hmm? Oh, Kuro. Mr. Kuro. Mm-mm-mm. He just wants cuddles and pets all day. Hmm? Yeah. He's such a pretty boy. With such long whiskers. Hmm.
Alright, Kuro, say bye to the stream.
Bye-bye.
Tomorrow probably will stream again. Because school has been canceled tomorrow. Once again. So. Till next time.